In the 1990s, Boston faced a crisis almost no American city did. An elevated highway that ran straight through downtown, carrying 200,000 cars a day, was decaying. Engineers warned it would eventually become unsafe. Everyone expected Boston to follow the same playbook every other city had used for half a century: rebuild it bigger. Instead, Boston chose something almost unthinkable. Rather than expanding the road, the city would bury it. $14 billion to put a highway underground, tear down the elevated structure, narrow surface streets, and replace lanes of traffic with parks. A decade of construction to make driving harder, not easier. And somehow, the gamble worked. Today, Boston feels nothing like Houston, Phoenix, or Los Angeles. It feels older, tighter, more walkable, almost European. So what exactly made Boston willing to bet everything on a plan that defied American logic? Why did this city work so differently from the rest of the country? And why is copying Boston's success almost impossible today? Drive through downtown Boston, and you'll quickly sense that something feels off. Streets bend where straight lines seem expected. They head northeast for a stretch, then drift northwest without warning. Your GPS keeps recalculating because the roads behave as though they answer to no consistent logic. Locals share a long-standing joke about how drunk cows drew the street map on their way home.
This routing makes no sense at all.
If only the founder were here to explain it to us.
Historians say this was never the case, yet the story survives because the disorder feels intentional rather than the product of simple happenstance. Compare this to other American cities, and the contrast becomes clear. New York uses numbered streets and avenues. Philadelphia had a grid plan before its first residents arrived. Chicago rebuilt after its Great Fire with strict geometric order. Their layouts make navigation intuitive because their patterns remain predictable. Boston pays little attention to such patterns. Its streets formed gradually in the 1600s as colonists carved paths linking the port to nearby settlements. Everything grew organically, influenced by day-to-day needs instead of any coordinated vision for how the city might function in the future. In 1708, city officials assigned permanent names to these informal routes, effectively freezing the layout in place. Future attempts to straighten curves or reorganize intersections no longer had a practical path forward. For modern drivers, this history produces steady irritation. But step out of the car and walk those same streets and the confusion fades. Narrow passages feel inviting rather than tight. The dense, winding routes that challenge drivers become pleasant for pedestrians, turning an apparent flaw into a surprising advantage. This tension between driving and walking helps define Boston's distinct character. The city supports one mode of movement while complicating the other, and by the 1950s, as America redesigned itself around automobiles, that imbalance was on the verge of turning into a full-blown planning crisis. But to understand why Boston eventually chose to remove its highway, we first need to look at the circumstances that led to its construction and why the city believed that decision made sense at the time. American cities in this mid-20th century rallied around one shared vision of progress. Highways were symbols of the future. Massive federal programs fueled construction. Urban planners viewed elevated roads as modern answers to long-standing congestion. Cities even competed to secure automotive investment. Boston followed this broader trend. During the 50s, work began on the Central Artery, an elevated highway cutting directly through downtown. Its construction required clearing homes and displacing 20,000 residents. The structure cast lasting shadows over entire blocks and produced constant, unbroken noise. The highway was meant to ease traffic. It failed almost from the start. Within a few years, the Central Artery ranked among the most congested roads in the nation.
What's it like to get in and out of Boston?
Oh, it's a mess. Most time from 6 in the morning till 9 o'clock any day.
The elevated span also aged quickly, developing cracks and structural concerns that increasingly troubled engineers. By the early 90s, the city confronted an unavoidable choice. The highway couldn't remain as it was. Something had to change. Other cities in similar situations chose a predictable route: rebuild larger. Add lanes, increase capacity. The logic appeared straightforward. Boston reviewed this familiar logic and chose another path entirely. City leaders proposed something unexpected: sink the highway underground, remove the elevated deck, and transform the reclaimed surface into public parks instead of asphalt. The proposal drew immediate criticism. The cost would be astronomical. The construction timeline stretched over a decade. And, most baffling of all, the project would reduce automotive capacity rather than expanding it. The reason Boston's gamble was even possible goes deeper than planning theory or political courage. To understand it, we have to look at the land itself, because the city's fate was sealed long before highways existed. Boston was built on a peninsula barely larger than 1 square mile. The land extended into the harbor with water on 3 sides. Its geography offered almost no opportunity for outward growth. Colonists arriving in 1630 encountered these limits immediately. Unlike settlements that expanded outward as populations increased, Boston had little choice but to grow upward and inward within the narrow space available. Other colonial cities had far more breathing room. Manhattan Island offered considerably more space. Philadelphia occupied a river valley with open land in several directions. These places could prepare for growth because their geography allowed expansion rather than restricting it. Boston's peninsula acted like a constraining frame. As more residents arrived, buildings pressed closer together. Streets stayed narrow because widening them required demolishing structures on both sides. Neighborhoods climbed the hills since flat ground was too valuable to devote to low-density development. This confined geography pushed the city toward European-style development patterns. Walk through Beacon Hill today and notice how 3- and 4-story townhouses form continuous edges along the streets. The North End held even more people as immigration surged during the 1800s. At its height, this single neighborhood had one of the highest population densities in the world. Architects addressed the intense crowding with solutions familiar across historic European centers. They carved interior courtyards into block interiors, creating open-air wells that offered light and ventilation to buildings enclosed on all sides. You'll see nearly identical strategies in Rome, Barcelona, and Paris, each developed independently because the underlying challenge was remarkably similar. Modern Boston packs nearly 14,000 people into every square mile of its urban core. Houston manages roughly 3,600. Phoenix sits even lower. These numbers show how differently places can organize human settlement. High concentrations of people enable walking because destinations cluster close together. They sustain small businesses as a result of customer bases existing within a few blocks. They justify frequent public transit because ridership volumes support operating costs. Low concentrations require automobiles for everything because distances between home, work, and shopping exceed comfortable walking range. This core difference explains why Boston could even imagine removing a highway while other cities kept building more roads. Density and geography were only half the equation. Boston's second advantage wasn't physical at all, it was cultural, and it influenced the spaces between buildings in ways most American cities never imagined. During the 1800s, Boston intentionally adopted French architectural ideas, adding buildings with mansard roofs and designing Commonwealth Avenue Mall as a deliberate nod to Parisian boulevards. This reflected a desire to project a level of European refinement and sophistication. When the elevated highway cut through downtown during the 50s, it did more than create traffic capacity. It severed connections between neighborhoods that had functioned as a unified district for centuries. The North End became isolated from the waterfront. Areas that were 5-minute walks apart suddenly had concrete barriers between them. The issue extended well beyond noise or pollution. The highway disturbed a city layout that had been evolving for 300 years. This context made the decision to bury the central artery understandable. City leaders were looking at generations of public spaces and neighborhood pathways disrupted by the elevated road. Putting it underground meant restoring connections that had been part of Boston's fabric for centuries, allowing the city to repair relationships between districts that had long depended on one another. The completed project created the Rose Kennedy Greenway, a continuous sequence of parks occupying the exact path the elevated highway used to dominate. Surface roads shrank from 10 lanes to 6. As those public spaces were woven into the city, something rare happened. Walking became a complete system, and in modern Boston, that system still guides how people live every day. Boston consistently ranks among the top 4 most walkable major cities in America. The downtown core can be traversed entirely on foot in under an hour. Neighborhoods integrate homes, shops, offices, and restaurants rather than isolating each in separate zones. Boston has one of the highest shares of transit commuters in the country, with well over 10% of workers relying on trains and buses instead of driving. The elevated train system links neighborhoods throughout the city. Living without owning a car shifts from possibility to practical reality for many residents. This differs from the usual American urban pattern. Many cities assume every adult will rely on a vehicle. Houston stretches over hundreds of square miles with limited transit. Phoenix spreads deep into the surrounding desert. Los Angeles built an entire metropolitan region, influenced by an expansive highway network. Boston's pre-automobile street network unintentionally created conditions that now support life beyond cars. The compressed routes that frustrate drivers benefit people on foot. The dense residential clusters that once seemed burdensome help transit succeed. The mixed-use districts that formed organically mirror what modern planners try to design with great effort. The metropolitan region contains 54 neighborhoods where residents can accomplish most routine needs on foot. Houston contains 16 such districts. Phoenix has 4. Walkable districts sustain local retail because residents pass storefronts several times each day. They encourage spontaneous social interaction as people encounter neighbors on sidewalks and in squares. They lessen feelings of isolation because stepping outside immediately brings you into contact with other people. Automobile-dependent cities reduce these interactions. You exit your house, enter your car in a garage, drive in isolation to your destination, park, complete your errand, return to your car, and drive home to your garage. Each trip occurs in a private bubble. When Boston decided to bury its highway, city leaders were betting that pedestrian connectivity mattered more than automotive capacity. That wager succeeded because the underlying conditions already existed. The walkable neighborhoods were already there. The public spaces had been established for centuries. The high concentrations of people supported every part of the system. But here's where the story turns. The very qualities that make Boston work are exactly the ones other cities no longer have, and no amount of redesign can easily bring them back. Boston spent $14 billion to bury a highway and create parks where concrete once ran. The choice challenged standard urban planning logic. Its price surpassed what many cities invest in their entire infrastructure budgets over decades. The gamble worked because Boston was always different. When the highway sliced through downtown, it disrupted something that had taken shape over 3 centuries. City leaders eventually concluded that rebuilding justified $14 billion. American cities spent much of the 20th century heading a different way. Many cities now hope to reverse this trajectory. They're investing in transit, building bike infrastructure, aiming to form walkable districts. Yet choices set decades ago still limit what's achievable. Boston shows that options beyond car dependence can succeed in America. Compact, walkable urbanism works here, drawing residents and investment in droves. The city is not free of real problems. Success has pushed costs so high that longtime residents face displacement. Housing pressures bring hardship. Yet the underlying urban form succeeds at its aims. Geography gave Boston limits that became advantages. The bustle that tests drivers is part of what helps Boston function for others. And as cities across the nation reassess their ties to cars, Boston's mix of geographic quirks and historical decisions shows what becomes possible when planning centers on people.